You walk through the interior of the palace of Susa as if crossing a world that does not belong to the living. The tall columns, decorated with hybrid creatures and symbols of the Persian Empire, seem to observe each step with stone eyes. The air is impregnated with thick incense, a sweet and bitter aroma at the same time, used only in rituals reserved for the king. It enters your breath as if trying to silence any thought that is not reverence. The light from the lamps spreads across the walls unevenly, creating patches of shadow that move with the slow rhythm of the flame. The silence is so profound that it seems to have weight. Here, no one speaks loudly. Here, every gesture needs to be calculated. Here, nothing happens by chance, and everything has meaning. Two concubines walk ahead of you, enveloped in long, delicate veils that barely let you see their faces. Their steps are short, choreographed, almost floating. They do not talk. They do not cry. They do not hesitate. They know that any emotion can be read as a challenge. And in the Persian palace, challenges are not punished with words. They are punished with absence. The absence of return, of explanations, of life. The maids who accompany them carry bronze containers with perfumed oils and small baskets with red fabrics. Intense red, deep red. Red that does not symbolize love. It symbolizes limit. Between the walls of this palace, red is the color of warning, of the border, of silence. You pass through an arch carved with figures of winged lions, and the muffled sound of footsteps turns into a soft echo. It is then that you realize that you are entering the most restricted wing of the harem, the corridor where only selected concubines can walk. That path is not public. The other women of the harem do not dare even look in that direction. And the eunuchs themselves, guardians of royal intimacy, keep their heads down when they cross that space. At the end of the corridor, a curtain of thick red fabric covers a dark wooden door with almost invisible carvings. The curtain moves slightly with the passage of air, as if it were breathing, as if the palace itself had life, as if the fabric kept with it everything it has witnessed: secrets, rituals, fears, disappearances. The concubines stop in front of the curtain. They do not touch it. They must not touch it. The curtain is a sacred symbol, the border that separates all those who can be forgotten from those who belong to the king. And it is at that moment that you feel that this palace, so majestic, so grandiose, so full of gold and jade, is in fact a structure made also of silences and shadows. One of the maids takes a step forward, holds a small lotus-shaped lamp, and raises it slowly towards the entrance. The light reveals subtle details, golden threads sewn around the red fabric, forming patterns that can only be seen when the flame dances in the right way. Patterns of serpents, flowers, eyes, blades. The Red Room is not just a place. It is a rite, a warning, a destiny. And as you watch those women standing still in front of the curtain, you understand silently why this room was never mentioned in the official records of the Persian Empire. Not out of forgetfulness, but out of prohibition. Some rooms exist to be talked about, others exist to be feared. The Red Room, however, exists to be concealed. The red curtain remains still in front of the concubines, but everything behind it pulsates with a tension that seems to have crossed centuries. Before understanding what happens inside, it is necessary to understand the mechanism that sustains this ritual, because nothing in the Persian Empire is isolated. Everything is part of a calculated, silent, immense structure. You walk a few steps to the side and notice something that many visitors never see. The Persian harem is not just a physical location. It is a political system as complex as the army, as organized as the royal council, as feared as the king himself. The concubines are not chosen for beauty, although all are beautiful in Persian eyes. They are selected for influence, for origin, for diplomatic utility, for what they represent to other noble families. Many are offered as living alliances, symbols of peace between peoples who prefer not to shed blood under the king's banner. And within the harem, there is hierarchy. A silent, rigid hierarchy, impossible to change without consequences. At the top are the royal consorts, women from families so powerful that even within the palace no one dares to touch them without authorization. Below them, the selected concubines, women whose destiny always depends on the will of the king, never their own. And below them, the newly arrived young women sent by governors, priests, and regional leaders as offerings to the throne. The eunuchs are the guardians of this hidden world. Not even soldiers enter there, not even counselors, not even generals. Only eunuchs, because for the Persians they were considered beings between two worlds, disciplined enough to obey, neutral enough not to threaten, silent enough to know more than anyone else, and never say anything. They control every door, every veil, every ritual, every breath that occurs within the women's wing. And it is precisely by understanding this system that the Red Room becomes even more terrifying, because it is not outside the structure, but at its center. It is the space reserved for the king, where not even the hierarchy of the harem has power. A room where no voice echoes and no record survives. While observing all this, you feel the importance of this content, and I make here a natural pause, almost imperceptible, to ask you something simple. If these hidden layers of Persian power interest you, consider subscribing to the channel and commenting the name of the city from where you are watching. This helps me to continue bringing stories that the world has tried to erase. The transition is smooth, almost a breath between ancient columns, and when it passes, you return to the harem, now more aware of the world that exists behind the curtain. The focus narrows. The breathing of the concubine seems more contained. The corridor seems narrower, and you understand that the next step of the narrative does not belong to the system. It belongs to the story that this system created, the origin of the Red Room, the place where only the king could enter. The corridor becomes silent again after the passage of the maids, and the red curtain seems to breathe alone, as if it kept inside it a secret that no one should hear. And to understand the existence of this forbidden room, it is necessary to go back in time, long before Susa, long before Darius, long before the height of the Persian Empire. Because the Red Room did not start as a room, it started as an idea that was born from fear. And it is at this point that the narrative changes pace. The imaginary camera recedes, the light becomes colder, the sound around seems to dissolve. You are taken to decades earlier, to the days when the first Achaemenid kings consolidated an empire so vast that no man could control it alone. It was necessary to create a place, a secret space, where the king was inviolable, not only physically, but symbolically. The court needed to believe that the king was inaccessible. The people needed to believe that he was untouchable, and the concubines needed to believe that crossing that door was crossing a limit from which one could not return as the same person. In the beginning, this space had no color. It was just an isolated chamber, built in the least illuminated corners of the first palaces. But during the reign of Cyrus, something changed. The Zoroastrian priests, responsible for interpreting divine signs, began to associate certain colors with spiritual elements. Red, specifically, became a symbol of threshold, transition, painful purification, and irrevocable destiny. It was not the color of love, it was the color of the irreversible. And when the king needed to establish absolute control over political alliances involving women from noble families, this symbolism seemed perfect. The color that separated what was public from what was secret, the color that the priests feared, the color that marked the place where only the king could enter, and from where few left the same. Then the first red fabrics were hung, first as veils, then as entire curtains, then as layers of thick fabrics capable of muffling even the sound of breathing. Over the generations, The ritual gained form and purpose. The room would be the space where the king would find selected concubines, not only for intimacy, but to establish alliances, test loyalties, weaken clans, reinforce power. Persian power was not always exercised with a sword. Sometimes it was exercised with silence, with a look, with rite. And no rite was so enveloped in silence as this one. Throughout the reigns of Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, the Red Room became more than an architectural part. It became an internal legend of the palace, a space that women saw but did not look at directly, a place where even the eunuchs walked with slower steps, as if they feared awakening something too old to be named. And it is at this point in the story that you realize the most disturbing thing. There is no official record about the Red Room, no writing, no inscription, no memorial. And this, in itself, is already proof of its existence, because in the Persian Empire, that which could not be controlled, or that which could not be said, was precisely that which carried the greatest power. The Red Room did not disappear from history, it was erased, and everything that is erased for a reason. Time seems to slow down inside the concubine's wing when the call is announced. There are no drums, there are no loud voices, just the sound of footsteps, light, almost floating steps that run through the corridor as if avoiding waking ancient spirits that sleep in the stone walls. The selection always starts in the same way, with silence. The maids enter one by one, carrying bronze basins with perfumed water, small containers of oil and red fabrics folded with almost religious precision. They move with the accuracy of someone who has practiced that ritual since childhood. They do not talk to each other. They do not look at the concubines. They do not express surprise or pity. In the Persian harem, emotions are a form of rebellion, and rebellion has no space between veils and hierarchies. The concubines stand in position, motionless, waiting to be evaluated. And it is here in this moment, as silent as it is sharp, that you realize the cruel logic behind the process. It is not about beauty. It is not about youth. It is not about desire. It is about power. The first stage is observation. The responsible matron, a woman with a firm gaze and unbeatable hands, passes slowly by each concubine, studying face, posture, breathing. She does not look for charm. She looks for submission. A concubine who keeps her eyes down and her posture impeccable is more valuable than a beauty who hesitates. The second stage is the touch. A small stick of perfumed wood is used to gently lift the chin of each woman. It is not a loving gesture. It is a test. If the chin trembles, she has failed. If the gaze rises too quickly, she has failed. If the gaze takes too long, she has failed equally. The third stage is purification. The maids pour warm water over the hands of the concubines, rubbing them with bitter petals that leave a persistent aroma on the skin. This smell is known as the perfume of obedience, because any concubine marked by it is recognized as selected, even before wearing the veil. The fourth stage is the removal of adornments. Bracelets, earrings, amulets brought from the family, everything is removed. The concubine who crosses the curtain of the Red Room no longer belongs to her lineage. She belongs to the king. One of the maids opens a dark wooden box and stores, item by item, the personal objects of the women. The sound of the metals touching the bottom of the box seems heavier than it should, as if each piece carried the identity of someone who is about to disappear. And then comes the moment that no concubine desires, but none dares to reject, the placing of the red veil. The maids approach with the folded fabric. It is not light like silk. It is not soft like cotton. It is thick, slightly rough, dyed with pigments that symbolize transition and destiny. When the veil is placed over the head of the selected concubine, she not only changes her appearance, she changes her category. The concubine with the red veil is separated from the others. Those who were not chosen lower their heads in respect, not out of pity, but out of fear. Because being selected does not mean being privileged, it means being surrendered. The air seems to become denser when the maids finish the preparation. The breathing of the chosen concubines becomes shorter, the corridors seem longer, the mosaics on the walls seem to observe. And it is at that moment, when the red veil rests on the concubine's face and prevents her from seeing clearly, that the entire harem understands. From here on, there is no more choice. There is only path. A path that ends in front of the oldest red curtain in the palace, the place where only the king could enter, and from where few women returned as they were before. The corridor that leads to the red room is not like the others. It was not made to be walked by many people. It was built to be crossed slowly by few women on very rare nights. And when the selected concubine takes the first step towards that forbidden space, the palace itself seems to change its breathing. The lamps attached to the walls create a ruby, soft, almost liquid light, which accompanies the woman like a living shadow. The flame moves in a strange way, as if it trembled not because of the wind, but because of the history accumulated in the walls. You feel this immediately. That corridor is not just a passage, it is a witness. The maids walk ahead, holding small torches decorated with golden threads. They say nothing, but their steps, perfectly synchronized, produce a continuous rhythm, like the beats of a collective heart that guides the concubine towards the destiny she never asked for. Behind her, two eunuchs follow in absolute silence. They do not approach, they do not touch her, they do not need to. Their mere presence already guarantees that the ritual is fulfilled without interruption. Unlike the Persian soldiers, who carry strength, the eunuchs carry silent authority, the authority that controls the harem. As the concubine advances, the sounds of the palace become more distant. The muffled conversations disappear. The hurried footsteps disappear. Even the natural noises of the night disappear. The corridor narrows reality, as if isolating the concubine from the outside world even before she crosses the curtain. At a certain point, the air becomes warmer, loaded with a sweet, almost sickening perfume, a mixture of oil, resin, and dried flowers. It is the aroma of the red room, a smell that the women of the harem recognize from afar. Some say that it never completely leaves the skin. The walls begin to show discrete inscriptions, geometric patterns, symbols of the sacred fire, small stylized eyes. They are not just decoration. They are reminders. They are warnings. They are marks that say, silently, from now on, you belong to the king. The micro-transition happens when the concubine reaches the middle of the corridor. The light changes. The silence changes. Even the feeling of space changes. Now the concubine passes through two stone columns sculpted in the shape of wings. The Persians believed that this point marked the line between the world of women and the world of the king, an invisible but definitive line. The maids slow down. The eunuchs stop a few meters behind. The concubine feels her body become lighter and heavier at the same time. The red curtain is ahead, thicker than it's seen from a distance, higher than any common door, more solemn than any altar. It does not sway with the wind. It does not reveal cracks. It does not give any clue of what is on the other side. The oldest maid approaches, checks the position of the concubine's veil, touches her shoulder with the tips of her fingers, and recites, almost in a whisper, "From this point on, you walk without return." It is the last warning, the last human gesture, the last thing the concubine hears before entering a world where the king is the only law. She takes a deep breath. The maids retreat. The eunuchs remain motionless. The lamp illuminates the red fabric as if it were igniting its own destiny. And then, slowly, the concubine raises her hand and touches the curtain that separates everything she once was from everything she will be. The red surface vibrates slightly under the concubine's touch, as if the fabric kept a memory of its own. The curtain is not just a physical border, it is a spiritual border. a limit that separates her from the world she knew, from the women who watched in silence, from the maids who prepared her, from the shadows that witnessed her selection. All that remains now is what is beyond that fabric, and it is exactly there, in that instant suspended between breath and destiny, that the ritual of the three signs begins. The concubine takes a deep breath. The curtain moves just enough to allow the passage of the arm, and the first sign happens. The first sign happens in the touch. It is not a common touch. It is a ritualistic gesture that requires precision. The fingertips run along a specific seam of the red fabric, a point marked by golden threads that are almost invisible to the naked eye. This seam represents the lineage of that king, his divine right to govern, and above all, his inviolability. By touching that thread, the concubine silently declares that she recognizes this right. She does not speak. She does not tilt her head. She does not bow. The touch is already enough. The maids behind her observe but do not interfere. It is the first recognition, the first gesture of surrender. When the touch ends, the curtain seems to quiet down, as if it accepted her presence. The concubine inhales again, and the second sign begins. The second sign is the sliding of the fabric. She holds the red edge with both hands and pulls it away slowly, firmly, without trembling, without hesitation. It does not matter if her heart is racing. The ritual requires mastery, even if the mastery is only appearance. The sound of the fabric moving is almost imperceptible, but within that silent corridor, it seems to echo throughout the harem wing. The women who were left behind recognize this sound. They have already heard other concubines produce this same movement. It is the sound of a symbolic door opening to a destiny that no one dares to name. When the curtain opens enough, the internal light of the room reveals only shadows. Shadows that do not give shape, but give presence. And the concubine knows that, from this point on, nothing else depends on her. She takes a step, and the third sign happens naturally, like a breath of silence. The third sign is absolute silence. No word should cross the door, neither from the concubine, nor from the maids, nor from the eunuchs. Silence is submission. Silence is acceptance. Silence is what separates those who enter from those who return transformed. When the concubine crosses the curtain, the room seems to absorb all the sound around. The internal light is low, golden, reflecting on the red walls as if they were made of living flesh. The lamps flicker slowly, projecting deep shadows that move like slow waves. The air is different, warmer, thicker, denser. She does not see the king immediately. No one sees him. His presence is perceived before it is seen, a weight in the air, a silence that is not absence but dominance. And at that moment, inside that forbidden chamber, happens that which was never recorded by the scribes, never drawn on walls, never described in parchments, not out of modesty, but out of power. What occurs there does not belong to public history. It belongs to the empire. It belongs to the king. It belongs to silence. The curtain closes behind the concubine like a sentence. The maids retreat, the eunuchs step back, and the corridor breathes again, lighter but also emptier, because a woman has just crossed the limit that separates the stories told from the stories erased. The red curtain closes behind the concubine with a slow, almost ritualistic movement, and the corridor returns to the deep silence that seems to shape the entire harem. The night passes, or perhaps remains still on the other side of that thick fabric, and when the ritual comes to an end, the maids return to lead the woman back. But it is the next day that her true destiny is revealed, and contrary to what many imagine, the Red Room was not just a forbidden room. It was a divider of worlds, a space where the concubine left one category and entered another, and this new position determined her entire life from then on. The Persian harem knew 4 paths, even though no one dared to pronounce them aloud, paths that defined power, silence, isolation, or disappearance. And it is here that the narrative slows down, breathes, and opens up to the first of them. The first destiny was to become a favorite consort. This was the rarest path, almost mythical. The concubine who received this destiny awoke, surrounded by experienced maids, received gold adornments, and was allowed to remain in the inner gardens, close to the king. It did not mean freedom, just a different form of imprisonment. The favorite consort was watched by the entire court, feared by other women, and used politically as a symbol of stability. Her family, if still alive, gained immediate prestige. But her body and her presence continued to belong to the king. She had power, yes, but never autonomy. The second destiny was to be transformed into a political concubine. This was the most common path. The concubine did not gain the brilliance of the favorite, but she was also not rejected. She was kept in a specific wing of the palace, accompanied by eunuchs and matrons who made sure she was always ready to be summoned when the king needed her, not as a woman, but as a symbol. She represented alliances, silent treaties, agreements between distant villages and provinces. Her life was carefully organized to reinforce ties that the king wished to maintain. She rarely went out. She rarely saw natural light. She was rarely remembered by the outside world. But she remained alive, a survival that within that palace was already a victory. The third destiny was obscurity within the harem. This was the cruelest path among those who remained within the palace. The concubine awoke in a distant wing, accompanied only by young maids and older women who had been discarded decades before. She was not called by name. She did not receive visits from the king. She did not receive news from her family. She simply disappeared within the labyrinth of the palace. She existed physically, but ceased to exist socially. She was kept alive, fed, dressed, but not to live, only to preserve the king's silence about her past. And this silence, in this case, was punishment enough. The fourth destiny, the most feared, was silent exile. When a concubine was considered inconvenient for politics, when her name represented a threat, when her lineage aroused suspicion, or when the ritual itself revealed something that the court preferred not to keep close, she was sent away, not as a prisoner, not as a servant, but as a shadow. She was led by eunuchs to a side gate of the palace, always at dawn, and placed in a litter that went to distant regions of the empire, villages, deserts, forgotten temples, borders where no one asked questions. The court called this honorable retirement. The women called it something simpler, more direct, more somber, disappearing. No one commented, no one investigated, no one asked. Because among the Persian concubines, there was an ancient saying, repeated in a low voice, "The woman who does not return from the red room returns in the wind." And as these four paths unfold before you, a truth becomes impossible to ignore. The red room was not just where the king could enter, it was where the destiny of women was decided with a precision as silent as it was cruel. The following morning dawns slowly over the palace of Susa. The golden light crosses the Persian arches and spreads across the painted tile floor, but curiously, it never fully illuminates the harem wing. The feeling is that that part of the palace was built not to be seen, but to be hidden. And it is in this eternal twilight that you begin to understand why almost nothing about the Red Room appears in the official records of the Persian Empire. It is not a lack of information, it is an excess of control. The first layer of this control came from the scribes. They recorded everything: battles, conquests, genealogies, treaties, offerings to the gods, public works, the words of the kings. But when the subject concerned the harem, their clay tablets and parchments suddenly became vague, superficial, incomplete. It is not a coincidence, it was an order. The Persian kings knew that the harem was the most vulnerable point of their authority. There were the silent alliances, The women offered by foreign rulers, the daughters of nobles, the living witnesses of the political tensions of the empire. Recording too much would be dangerous. Recording too little was safer. The second layer of silence came from the eunuchs, who were much more than guardians. They were the eyes and ears of the king within the harem. They knew who entered. They knew who left. They knew who did not return. But eunuchs did not write history. They preserved silence. And silence in that society was power. Their figure runs through the shadows of the walls with a strange mixture of authority and invisibility. The eunuch was not a slave, but he was also not a noble. He was a function, a living piece destined to protect the secrets that sustained the empire, and no secret was as well guarded as the Red Room. The third layer of concealment came from the kings themselves. Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, men who ruled with a firm hand and full awareness that part of the power lies in being seen, and part in not being questioned. The Red Room was not just a forbidden room. It was a room forbidden by invisible decree, a decree that was never written, but that governed the lives of hundreds of women. You pass through a narrow corridor and see ancient inscriptions on the walls, excerpts of poems, fragmented names, broken lines that seem to have been scraped by the hands of someone who did not want to leave traces. Some of these inscriptions are so old that they seem to whisper discomfort, fear, or warning. Among modern archaeologists, there is a disturbing consensus. Absences say more than presences. In palaces so well documented, so meticulously planned, so imbued with details, the total lack of references to the Red Room does not make sense, unless the erasure was intentional, and intentional erasure in history almost always points to truths that should not be known. The micro-transition happens when you pass through a smaller door and arrive at a room with walls painted with floral symbols. It is a quiet, silent, seemingly insignificant room, but in the center of it there is a mosaic with details that only a trained eye perceives. Red lines that form the outline of a half-open door. There is no title, there is no text, just the drawing, a red door, half open. Experts say that this mosaic represents the passage of the concubine into the domain of the king. But among the women of the harem, the meaning was different. The half-open door was a warning. You can enter, but you may not return. What kings, eunuchs, and chroniclers hid was not the room itself. It was what it meant. It was what happened after it. It was the psychological impact that marked all the concubines who crossed that border. It was the absolute power exercised behind curtains that no one dared to lift. And when you observe this forgotten mosaic in the corner of the palace, you understand the most uncomfortable truth of all. The Red Room did not disappear because it was irrelevant. It disappeared because it was indescribable. The silent chamber where the concubine awakens seems to exist outside of time. The air is still, almost motionless, as if it had been sealed inside so that no echo of the past night would escape. She opens her eyes slowly, not out of delicacy, but out of fear of what she will see around her. And discovering that the room has not changed at all does not reassure her. On the contrary, the absence of change is proof that everything has changed within her. The walls remain red, the lamps remain lit, the maids remain motionless, with their eyes lowered. But she is no longer the woman who entered there hours before. The Red Room does that. It undoes an identity and creates another. It erases a name and replaces it with silence. It transforms a woman into a role that the king can use, keep, move, or discard according to his political need. The concubine feels this even before she gets up. The fear is not explicit. It is not an explosion. It is something deeper, thinner, sharper, like a thread stretched inside the chest. A quiet fear that hurts without wounding. When the maids help her to stand, she realizes that everyone avoids her gaze, not out of contempt, but out of recognition. Whoever crosses the Red Room carries in their eyes a shadow that only those who have already survived this ritual can identify. A shadow that is not born of violence, but of understanding. Understanding of what? That her life is now divided into two parts. The part before the curtain, which ceases to exist, and the part after it, which does not belong to her completely. She is led out of the chamber slowly, with steps so silent that it seems that the floor is made of dust. The palace receives her as it receives all the other concubines who have already passed through there, with indifference. There is no celebration. There is no welcome. There is no human voice that calls her by name, and it is in this silence that her mind begins to work. Some women try to rationalize what happened, others try to forget, others try to cling to small memories of their previous life. Others simply collapse inside without anyone noticing, but all, without exception, face the same devastating feeling that they now live a life that they did not choose and that they cannot refuse. The concubine walks through the corridors of the harem with the red veil still over her head, but now it weighs more. It is the reminder of what she went through and of what she lost. The other women watch when she passes. Some lower their eyes, others turn their faces away, others just take a deep breath, as if they were reviewing their own history reflected in her. Among the older concubines, there is a ritualistic behavior that does not appear in any record. They lightly touch the pulse when they see a woman who has come out of the red room for the first time. It is not a greeting, it is not a salutation, it is recognition. It is a silent way of saying, "I know." The concubine feels this. She feels that she now belongs to an invisible group, not by choice, but by destiny. A group marked by nights that cannot be counted, by truths that cannot be told, by memories that cannot be explained. And then, when she finally arrives at the room where she will rest for the next few hours, something within her becomes definitive. She no longer has control over her story. She only has control over how she remains silent within it. The entire harem breathes this truth. And the concubine, now part of this collective breath, understands that the red room does not destroy the body. It destroys what exists between the body and the name. It transforms people into shadows. It transforms shadows into rules. It transforms rules into destiny. And destiny in the Persian Empire can never be questioned. In the late afternoon, when the sun begins to dissolve behind the stone mountains and the Persian palace fills with a golden silence, the corridor of the Red Room remains untouched by the light. It does not change. It does not age. It does not lose the air of secrecy that surrounds everything that exists between those walls. It is strange how some places seem to resist time. The throne changes, the king ages, empires fall, the statues break. But certain spaces, those built to keep silence, survive. The Red Room is one of them. The stories that happened there were never written, never told, never revealed by the men who ruled or by the women who survived. Not because there was a lack of words, but because most of the truths of the ancient world lived and died inside rooms where only power was allowed to enter. And perhaps this is the most disturbing detail of all. The concubines who went through that ritual walked through the palace as if they carried something invisible in their eyes. Not trauma, not explicit pain, not revolt. They carried something more difficult to describe, a kind of mute awareness about the weight of destiny. Destinies decided without witnesses, without records, without hope of return. Modern archaeologists study fragments, inscriptions, and scattered accounts, trying to understand how the intimate life of the Persian court worked. But none of them finds what matters most. None finds what the Red Room really did to the women who crossed its curtain. Because this type of truth is not trapped in stone, nor in ink, nor in palace officials. It is trapped in what disappears, and everything that disappears in the end reveals more than it keeps. Sometimes when we walk through ruins and observe broken columns, destroyed doors, and incomplete mosaics, we forget that the cruelest part of history is not in what is left, but in what was erased. The Red Room is one of those voids, a void that still breathes. And as you observe this story, you realize that the strength of the Persian Empire was not only in the army, or in the engineering, or in the monumental palaces. It was in the ability to control what could or could not be seen. And what could not be seen was always the most important. If you want more forgotten, silenced, and hidden stories in the shadows of history, subscribe and continue following the channel. There are still many secrets waiting to be revealed.